What happens when the people in power stop serving the people? It's a terrifying question, isn't it? Because the very foundation of governance, the social contract if you will, is built on the idea that those in charge are there to protect and uplift their citizens. But what happens when that contract is not just broken but shredded, burned, and its ashes scattered into the wind by the very people who swore to uphold it? You get a horror story, a real-life non-fiction horror story where the monsters are not hiding under the bed, but sitting in the highest offices of the land, making decisions that lead to unimaginable suffering. Tonight, we're going to look at some of those monsters. We're embarking on a rather grim journey through modern history to look at 10 notorious politicians who became infamous for policies and actions that brought ruin, despair, and death to their own citizens. These are not tales of simple political missteps or unpopular policies. These are stories of profound, shocking disregard for human life and dignity. They are cautionary tales of what happens when power is consolidated in the hands of those who see their people not as a responsibility, but as a resource to be exploited or an obstacle to be removed. So brace yourselves. This won't be an easy watch, but it is a necessary one. We'll be exploring the darkest corridors of political history, where leaders entrusted with the fate of nations chose to become its greatest threat. From Europe to Asia, Africa to the Middle East, the pattern is chillingly similar. Understanding how these figures rose to power and the devastation they wrought is crucial, because the ghosts of their actions still haunt our world today, reminding us of the fragility of freedom and the constant need for vigilance. Let's start with a man whose revolutionary pseudonym meant Man of Steel, which, in hindsight, feels less like a nod to strength and more to a cold, unfeeling, and brutally hard instrument of death: Joseph Stalin. After clawing his way to the top of the Soviet Union's political heap following Lenin's death, Stalin didn't just govern, he consumed. He launched a series of 5-year plans to rapidly industrialize the nation, which sounds vaguely productive until you realize the human cost was not just a rounding error, it was the entire point of the equation. His policy of collectivization forced millions of peasants off their land and onto state-run farms, a move so catastrophic it manufactured a famine. This wasn't just a bad harvest, no, this was a state-engineered starvation. In Ukraine, this period is known as the Holodomor, the death by hunger, where millions perished while the state seized their grain and sealed their borders. It was a deliberate act of annihilation. Imagine a leader looking at his own starving people he is meant to lead, and seeing not a tragedy to be averted, but a political problem to be liquidated. The sheer scale of the cruelty is mind-numbing. It's a level of disregard for human life that is almost impossible to comprehend, yet it was the standard operating procedure for the Kremlin. But Stalin's paranoia was as vast as his country. He couldn't just starve his people, he had to terrorize them too. He unleashed the Great Purge, a campaign of political repression that saw anyone, from top party officials and military leaders to ordinary artists, intellectuals, and citizens, accused of being an enemy of the people. The accusations were, of course, ludicrous. People were arrested in the dead of night, subjected to show trials where the verdict was predetermined, and then either executed with a bullet to the back of the head, or shipped off to the Gulag, a sprawling network of forced labor camps, where they were worked to death in the frozen wastelands of Siberia. The Gulag system was a cornerstone of Stalin's regime, a vast archipelago of suffering that swallowed millions. These weren't just prisons. They were engines of destruction, designed to break the human spirit before breaking the human body. People were arrested for telling a joke, for having a foreign-sounding name, for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The social fabric of the nation was torn apart by fear. Neighbors informed on neighbors, children on parents. Trust, the very glue of society, dissolved into a pervasive, gnawing terror. When you add up the deaths from the purges, the famines, the deportations, and the brutal conditions in the gulags, the numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that Stalin was responsible for the deaths of at least 20 million of his own people. Let that number sink in. 20 million. That's not a statistic. It's a galaxy of extinguished lives, of families destroyed, of potential erased. Joseph Stalin didn't just disregard his people, he waged a relentless, decades-long war against them, cementing his legacy not as a builder of a nation, but as one of history's most prolific mass murderers. From one totalitarian nightmare, we move to another, a man whose name has become synonymous with evil itself, Adolf Hitler. When he took power in Germany in 1933, He promised to restore national pride and economic stability to a country crippled by the aftermath of World War I. What he delivered was a descent into a racist, militaristic dystopia that would set the entire world on fire. His vision for Germany was not one of prosperity for all Germans, but one built on a delusional and hateful ideology of racial purity. The people he claimed to serve were a fiction, a narrowly defined Aryan race, and anyone who didn't fit that mold was deemed subhuman. The initial signs were there for all to see. He dismantled democracy with terrifying speed, establishing the Third Reich, a totalitarian state where the Nazi Party controlled every aspect of life. Political opponents were the first to go, rounded up and sent to concentration camps like Dachau. But his venom was most potently directed at Germany's Jewish population. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of their citizenship, forbade them from marrying Germans, and systematically pushed them out of public life. This was the legal framework for genocide, the bureaucratic scaffolding upon which the Holocaust would be built. Hitler's disregard for his own people extended even to those he claimed to champion. He indoctrinated an entire generation of German youth, turning children into fanatical soldiers willing to die for his twisted cause. The German economy was reoriented entirely around the war machine, preparing for a conflict that he believed was Germany's destiny. He promised Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people, a promise that could only be fulfilled through the conquest and subjugation of other nations, particularly in Eastern Europe. His ambition was not just to rule Germany, but to dominate the world. Then came the final solution, the systematic, industrialized murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, Slavs, Roma, homosexuals, disabled individuals, and political dissidents. This was the Holocaust, an act of barbarism so profound it permanently scarred the conscience of humanity. This wasn't a byproduct of war, it was a central objective. It was the ultimate expression of his ideology, a belief that an entire group of people could be erased from existence. He turned his own nation into a factory of death, co-opting its bureaucracy, its industry, and its people into a monstrous project of extermination. In the end, Hitler's reign brought nothing but ruin to Germany itself. As Allied forces closed in, he demanded a scorched earth policy, ordering the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure. He famously declared that if the war was lost, the German people would perish with it, as they had proven themselves unworthy. In his final, pathetic moments in a Berlin bunker, his ultimate disregard was laid bare. He had never served the German people. He had used them as fuel for his own megalomaniacal fantasies, and when that fuel was spent, he was happy to see the entire nation burn with him. The devastation he left behind in Germany and across Europe is a testament to the catastrophic consequences of such absolute hateful power. Imagine a leader who looks at his country's history, its culture, its cities, and its educated populace, and decides that the only way forward is to erase it all, to literally reset the calendar to year zero. That is the story of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. When his forces captured the capital, Phnom Penh, in 1975, it wasn't a liberation. It was the beginning of an auto-genocide, a regime turning on its own people with a ferocity that is almost beyond belief. His goal was to create a completely agrarian communist utopia, a society stripped of all modern foreign or intellectual influences. The first step was to empty the cities. Within days of their victory, the Khmer Rouge forced millions of people from urban centers into the countryside at gunpoint. There were no exceptions for the elderly, the sick, or the young. The streets of Phnom Penh, once bustling with life, became silent, haunted corridors. People who had been doctors, teachers, lawyers, and artists were now forced into brutal, back-breaking labor in the collective farms, which became known as the killing fields. The regime declared that knowledge was a disease and intellectuals were the enemy. The criteria for being an intellectual were terrifyingly broad. Simply wearing glasses, speaking a foreign language, or having soft hands could be a death sentence. The Khmer Rouge's paranoia was absolute. They sought to dismantle the very concept of family, forcing children into separate labor camps where they were indoctrinated to report on their own parents. Religion was banned, temples were desecrated, and monks were executed. The regime's goal was to break every social bond, leaving the individual completely isolated and subservient to the state, known only as Angkar, or the organization. Life in the killing fields was a living hell. The people were subjected to 12-hour workdays with minuscule food rations, leading to mass starvation and disease. Malnutrition was rampant. Yet, The slightest complaint or perceived laziness was met with immediate, brutal punishment. People were bludgeoned to death with farming tools to save bullets. The most infamous prison was Tuol Sleng, or S-21, a former high school in Phnom Penh that was converted into a center for interrogation, torture, and execution. Thousands were sent there, meticulously photographed and documented before being murdered. In just 4 years, from 1975 to 1979, Pol Pot's regime was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 1.7 to 2 million Cambodians. That was nearly a quarter of the country's entire population. It was a systematic purge of a nation's own soul, an attempt to violently reshape society by eliminating anyone and anything connected to the past. Pol Pot, or Brother Number One, wasn't just a leader who disregarded his people. He was a butcher who saw them as raw material for a demented social experiment, and who was willing to pile up mountains of skulls to achieve his vision. So, our next subject is not a figure from the past, but a man whose oppressive rule is happening right now, in the 21st century. Kim Jong-un of North Korea. He inherited power from his father, Kim Jong-il, who inherited it from his father, Kim Il-sung, making North Korea the world's only communist dynasty. It's, less a country and more a giant state-run prison camp masquerading as a nation, and Kim Jong-un is its third-generation warden. The official narrative is that he is a benevolent, godlike supreme leader. But the reality for the 25 million people trapped under his rule is a nightmare of control, fear, and deprivation. The entire state is built around the Juche ideology of self-reliance and a cult of personality so extreme it borders on the absurd. Citizens are taught from birth to worship the Kim family. Their portraits hang in every home and building, and any disrespect, intended or not, can lead to imprisonment or execution for you and 3 generations of your family. Information is completely controlled. There is no internet, only a state-run intranet. The radio and television are locked to government channels that pump out a constant stream of propaganda about the genius of the leader and the evils of the outside world, particularly the United States and South Korea. While Kim Jong-un enjoys a life of obscene luxury, with private jets, yachts, imported cheese, and cognac, the vast majority of his people live in crushing poverty. The state's resources are not directed towards feeding its population or building a functional economy, but are funneled almost entirely into the military and the development of nuclear weapons. This military-first policy has led to chronic food shortages and periods of devastating famine. The people are expected to endure hardship and starvation as a patriotic duty, all while the regime parades its latest missiles in extravagant military displays. Human rights are, well, non-existent. The state operates a network of political prison camps known as Kwanliso, which are believed to hold hundreds of thousands of prisoners. According to defectors and satellite imagery, these camps are places of unimaginable horror, featuring forced labor, systematic starvation, torture, and public executions. People are imprisoned for life for crimes as minor as attempting to flee the country or listening to a foreign radio broadcast. It is a system designed not just to punish dissent, but to extinguish the very thought of it. Kim Jong-un has continued and arguably intensified this legacy of oppression. He has consolidated his power through brutal purges, including the shocking execution of his own uncle, Jang Song-taek, and the alleged assassination of his half-brother Kim Jong-nam. He projects an image of strength to the world through nuclear brinkmanship, but that strength is built on the backs of a terrorized and suffering population. He is a modern-day tyrant who treats his country as a personal fiefdom, and his people as disposable pawns in his quest for power and security for his regime. For decades, Iraq was ruled by the iron fist of a man whose name became a byword for brutality in the Middle East, Saddam Hussein. He rose through the ranks of the Ba'ath Party, a secular Arab nationalist movement, and seized absolute power in 1979. He began his presidency by convening a meeting of party officials, reading out a list of alleged conspirators, and having them dragged from the room, one by one, to be executed. It was a televised purge, a chilling statement of intent that broadcast to the entire nation and the world that his rule would be maintained through absolute, unflinching terror. Saddam's regime was a police state of terrifying efficiency. A vast network of security agencies and informants ensured that dissent was impossible. Torture chambers were a standard feature of his government. People lived in constant fear of the Mukhabarat, the secret police who could make anyone disappear for the slightest perceived offense. He cultivated a grandiose cult of personality, with his portrait plastered across the country, depicting him in various heroic guises, as a modern statesman, an ancient Babylonian king, a devout Muslim. But behind the posters was a man who ruled through fear and violence. His disregard for his own people was most horrifically demonstrated in his campaigns against Iraq's Kurdish population in the north. In the late 1980s, he launched the Anfal campaign, a systematic genocide that resulted in the deaths of up to 182,000 Kurds. The campaign's most infamous moment came in 1988, in the town of Halabja. Iraqi warplanes dropped a cocktail of chemical weapons, including mustard gas and sarin, on the civilian population. An estimated 5,000 people, mostly women and children, died within minutes, choking to death in the streets. It was a monstrous act of a leader gassing his own citizens. Saddam's megalomania also led him into disastrous wars that cost hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives. First, the brutal 8-year war with Iran in the 1980s, a bloody stalemate that achieved nothing but mass death. Then, his 1990 invasion of Kuwait, which led to the First Gulf War and crippling international sanctions. These sanctions, combined with his own mismanagement and corruption, devastated the Iraqi economy and society, causing widespread poverty and a collapse in public services, while Saddam and his inner circle continued to live in opulent palaces. He consistently prioritized his own power and regional ambitions over the well-being of the Iraqi people. He used the nation's vast oil wealth not to build a prosperous society, but to fund his military, his palaces, and his instruments of repression. He pitted different ethnic and religious groups, Sunni, Shia, Kurd, against each other to maintain his grip on power. Saddam Hussein's legacy is one of mass graves, chemical attacks, devastating wars, and a nation traumatized by decades of fear. He was a leader who saw his people as nothing more than subjects to be controlled and, when necessary, exterminated. Nicolae Ceaușescu, the self-proclaimed Geniul din Carpatii, or Genius of the Carpathians, ruled Romania for 24 years with a uniquely bizarre and cruel blend of Stalinism and North Korean-style personality cult. He and his wife Elena held the nation in a grip of fear and absurdity. His regime was characterized by extreme austerity measures imposed on the population to pay off the country's foreign debt, a goal he pursued with a fanaticism that completely ignored the immense human suffering it caused. While his people were freezing and starving, he was building himself the world's second-largest administrative building, the colossal Palace of the Parliament. The austerity of the 1980s was brutal. Heat and electricity were severely rationed, leading to frigid winters in people's homes. Food was scarce, with long lines for basic necessities like bread and cooking oil becoming a daily reality. The state-controlled television broadcast for only a few hours a day, mostly showing propaganda films praising the Ceaușescus and their supposed achievements. It was a gray, miserable existence, enforced by the dreaded Securitate, one of the most pervasive and brutal secret police forces in the Eastern Bloc, with a vast network of informers that turned society into a prison of mistrust. One of Ceaușescu's most infamous and cruel policies was his obsession with increasing the country's population. He banned abortion and contraception in 1966, making them illegal for all women under 45 who had not yet borne 4 children, later raised to 5. State agents, known as the menstrual police, would regularly examine female workers in factories to ensure they were not trying to circumvent the law. This policy did not lead to a happy baby boom, but to a national tragedy. Thousands of women died from unsafe, illegal abortions. The policy also resulted in a massive number of children being abandoned by families who simply could not afford to care for them. These children were warehoused in horrific state-run orphanages. The conditions in these institutions were medieval. Children were left neglected, malnourished, and unloved, often tied to their beds, living in filth. When the regime finally fell, the world was shocked by the images of these skeletal, traumatized children, a direct and haunting legacy of Ceaușescu's demographic fanaticism. It was a policy that treated human beings as mere production units for the state. The end for Ceaușescu came swiftly and violently in December 1989. When a protest in the city of Timisoara was met with lethal force, the unrest spread across the country. The army defected to the side of the people. Ceaușescu and Elena tried to flee but were captured, subjected to a brief show trial, and executed by a firing squad on Christmas Day. Their downfall revealed the utter bankruptcy of their rule, a regime that had systematically impoverished, repressed, and dehumanized its own people in the name of a twisted, megalomaniacal vision. Robert Mugabe began his political life as a revolutionary hero, a key figure in the struggle for Zimbabwe's independence from white minority rule. When he came to power in 1980, he was hailed internationally as a pragmatic leader, speaking of reconciliation and a bright future for his nation. But over the next 37 years, that promise would curdle into a tragic story of a liberator who became an oppressor, a man who clung to power by any means necessary, driving a once prosperous nation, the so-called breadbasket of Africa, into economic collapse and political violence. The early signs of his authoritarian streak were there. In the 1980s, he launched the Gukura Hundi, a series of massacres in the Matabeleland region, home to his political rivals. His North Korean-trained 5th Brigade killed an estimated 20,000 civilians, mostly from the Ndebele ethnic group. It was a brutal consolidation of power that the world largely ignored at the time. For years he managed to maintain a veneer of stability, but as his popularity waned, his methods became more desperate and destructive. The turning point for many was the land reform program that began in 2000. Faced with growing political opposition, Mugabe sanctioned the violent seizure of white-owned commercial farms. While the principle of land redistribution was supported by many, the execution was chaotic and honestly, catastrophic. The farms were often handed over not to skilled farmers, but to his political cronies and war veterans with no experience in large-scale agriculture. The result was the collapse of the country's agricultural backbone. Food production plummeted, leading to widespread shortages and famine. This economic mismanagement, combined with rampant corruption and international sanctions, triggered one of the most extreme cases of hyperinflation in history. In 2008, the Zimbabwean dollar became effectively worthless. The central bank printed notes with denominations of $100 trillion. Life savings were wiped out overnight, the country's infrastructure crumbled, hospitals ran out of medicine, and millions of Zimbabweans fled the country as economic refugees, just seeking a better life elsewhere. Mugabe, meanwhile, blamed the West for all of his country's problems while celebrating his lavish birthdays with extravagant parties. Throughout his rule, Mugabe used violence and intimidation to crush political dissent. Elections were consistently marred by fraud and brutality. Opposition supporters were beaten, tortured, and killed by state security forces and ruling party militias. He held on to power through fear, rigging the system to ensure he could never lose. By the time he was finally ousted in a military coup in 2017 at the age of 93, Robert Mugabe had left behind a legacy of ruin. The hero of liberation had become a cautionary tale of how the love of power can corrupt absolutely, sacrificing the well-being of an entire nation for the sake of, well, one man's ego. The Doctor of Death, Bashar al-Assad. Like Kim Jong-un, Bashar al-Assad was an heir to a dictatorship. He inherited power in Syria in the year 2000 from his father, Hafez al-Assad, who had ruled the country with an iron fist for 30 years. Bashar, a London-trained ophthalmologist, was at first seen by some as a potential reformer, a modernizer who might open up the repressive state. But this brief glimmer of hope, known as the Damascus Spring, was quickly extinguished. It soon became clear that he was fully prepared to continue his father's legacy of brutal minority Alawite rule over a majority Sunni country. For a decade, he maintained the status quo, a suffocating police state, rampant corruption, and no political freedom. But his true nature was revealed to the world in 2011. Inspired by the Arab Spring uprisings across the region, peaceful pro-democracy protests erupted in Syria. Assad's response was not dialogue or reform, it was bullets. He ordered his security forces to open fire on unarmed demonstrators, turning protests into massacres and sparking a cycle of violence that would plunge the nation into one of the 21st century's most devastating civil wars. What followed has been over a decade of unimaginable horror. Assad has waged a war of annihilation against his own people, especially those in opposition-held areas. He has shown a complete and utter disregard for civilian life, employing tactics that honestly constitute war crimes on a massive scale. His military has systematically targeted hospitals, schools, and markets. He has used siege warfare, deliberately starving entire cities and towns into submission, a tactic medieval in its cruelty. The city of Aleppo, once a vibrant cultural and economic hub, was bombed into rubble. And most horrifically, Assad has repeatedly used chemical weapons against his own population. Despite international outrage and condemnation, his regime has deployed chlorine gas and the nerve agent sarin in dozens of attacks, killing thousands of civilians, including many children, in the most agonizing way imaginable. The images from places like Ghouta and Khan Sheikhoun, of people gasping for air, foaming at the mouth, are a permanent stain on the conscience of the world and a testament to the depths of his depravity. The Syrian civil war, fueled by Assad's refusal to relinquish power, has resulted in the deaths of over 500,000 people. It has created the largest refugee crisis since World War II, with more than half of the country's pre-war population forced to flee their homes. Assad, with the crucial military backing of Russia and Iran, has managed to cling to power, but he now rules over a shattered, impoverished, and deeply traumatized country. He is a leader who chose to destroy his nation rather than lose control of it, a doctor who chose to become a purveyor of death. The brotherly leader's reign of terror, Muammar Gaddafi. For 42 years, Libya was the personal playground of one of the world's most eccentric and brutal dictators, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. He seized power in a military coup in 1969 and established a bizarre political system he called the Jamahiriya, or State of the Masses, outlined in his infamous Green Book. In theory, it was a form of direct democracy. In reality, it was a totalitarian state with no constitution and no real laws, where Gaddafi's every whim was absolute. He styled himself the brotherly leader and guide of the revolution, but he ruled as a tyrant. Gaddafi's regime was built on oil wealth and fear. He used the country's vast petroleum reserves to fund a lavish lifestyle for himself and his family, as well as to sponsor international terrorism and destabilize neighboring countries. At home, he tolerated no dissent whatsoever. His revolutionary committees and security forces hunted down and eliminated any perceived opponents. Public hangings were broadcast on television to terrorize the population into submission. His most notorious act of internal repression was the 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre, where an estimated 1,200 political prisoners were gunned down in cold blood. He was a master of bizarre theatrics on the world stage, known for his flamboyant outfits, his all-female bodyguard troop known as the Amazonian Guard, and his rambling, incoherent speeches at the United Nations. This eccentricity often masked the sheer brutality of his rule at home. He created a pervasive cult of personality, and Libyans were forced to live under a system where the only ideology was loyalty to Gaddafi himself. The country's institutions were hollowed out, leaving everything dependent on his personal control. Like other dictators in the region, his downfall came with the Arab Spring in 2011. When protests broke out in the city of Benghazi, Gaddafi's response was swift and merciless. He derided the protesters as rats and cockroaches and promised to go house to cleanse Libya. He unleashed his military on his own people, using tanks and aircraft against civilians. His open threats of a massacre in Benghazi prompted a NATO-led military intervention to protect the civilian population. The intervention tipped the scales in favor of the rebels, and after months of brutal fighting, Gaddafi's regime collapsed. He went on the run, but was eventually captured by rebel fighters in his hometown of Sirte. He was killed in the street, a grim and violent end to a 42-year reign of terror. Gaddafi left behind a country with no functional institutions, awash with weapons, and deeply divided along tribal and regional lines. He had treated Libya as his personal property for so long that, when he was gone, the nation itself fractured, a direct legacy of a leader who saw his people as nothing more than subjects in his grand delusional theater. El Caudillo's long shadow Francisco Franco. Our last guy takes us back to Western Europe, to a dude who ran Spain like a total boss for almost 40 years, General Francisco Franco. Franco, or El Caudillo, didn't get his job by winning an election or pulling off some sneaky palace coup. Nah, he got there through a super bloody and messed up civil war. From 1936 to 1939, his nationalist crew, with some major help from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, fought against the real government, the democratically elected Second Spanish Republic. This war was seriously brutal, like a practice run for World War II, and it left Spain in pieces, with 1 million people dead. Franco winning in 1939 didn't bring peace though, it just kicked off a long, organized crackdown. He immediately started getting rid of anyone who disagreed with him. The time after the war is called the White Terror. Hundreds of thousands of Republicans, socialists, communists, anarchists, liberals, and smart folks were thrown in jail, sent to concentration camps, forced to work, or just straight up killed. They're still finding mass graves from back then in Spain even today. He wanted to clean out the country of anyone who didn't fit his super narrow old-school idea of a Catholic, conservative, and united Spain. Under Franco, Spain became like an outcast, cut off from the rest of Europe for decades. He forced a strict, bossy way of thinking called Nacional Catolicismo, which was a mix of super intense nationalism and strict Roman Catholicism. Political parties were banned except for his own Falange group. Labor unions were illegal, the news was heavily censored, and culture was squashed. Spain's different regional identities, especially in Catalonia and the Basque Country, got hammered. Their languages were banned from public use, and their freedom was crushed. The government was super old-fashioned about gender roles. Women's rights got seriously cut back, with their legal standing basically depending on their dads or husbands. Divorce and birth control were outlawed. The government had total control over society, backed up by the police and the always-there Catholic Church. For decades, Spain was like a country stuck in time, a place of quiet and fear where political freedom was just a distant dream. While the rest of Western Europe was rebuilding and getting into democracy after World War II, Spain was stuck under Franco's heavy shadow. Franco ruled until he died in 1975. Only then could Spain start its tough journey back to being a democracy. His long time in charge left deep scars on the country's soul. The silence he forced for decades meant that the country couldn't really deal with the pain of the Civil War and the crackdown that came after. Francisco Franco was a leader who got power by fighting his own people, and then spent the next 36 years making sure one half of the country kept the other half down for good. A harsh legacy from a guy who thought dividing people and shutting them up was the only way to stay in charge. The Echoes of Tyranny: Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Pol Pot, Kim Jong-un, Saddam Hussein, Nicolae Ceaușescu, Robert Mugabe, Bashar al-Assad, Muammar Gaddafi, and Francisco Franco. 10 names from 10 different corners of the world, all united by one terrifying commonality: a complete and utter willingness to sacrifice their own people for the sake of their own power. Their stories are a grim catalog of humanity's capacity for cruelty, a showcase of how ideology, paranoia, and megalomania can turn a leader into a nation's greatest enemy. They turned breadbaskets into dust bowls, cities into tombs, and citizens into either subjects or corpses. The methods varied, from industrialized genocide and chemical warfare to engineered famines and secret police terror. But the result was always the same: immense, unimaginable human suffering. These are not just stories from history books, they are stark warnings. They demonstrate the catastrophic danger of allowing any single individual or group to accumulate power without checks, without accountability, and without a fundamental respect for human rights and the rule of law. When leaders stop seeing their people as their responsibility and start seeing them as an instrument or an obstacle, the path to tragedy is laid bare. History has shown us the dangers of unchecked power. Let's remember these lessons to protect our future. The ghosts of the millions who perished under these regimes call on us to be vigilant, to champion democracy, to defend human rights, and to always question those who demand our absolute loyalty. Because the moment we forget the atrocities of the past, we risk allowing them to be repeated. The price of freedom, as it turns out, is eternal vigilance against the monsters who would claim to lead us, only to lead us to our doom. Thank you for watching.